And welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. And I'm thrilled to be here in October with a horror panel with Anne Heltzel, Christopher Golden, and S.A. Barnes, who we will be calling Stacey today. So before I introduce them and we get into our questions, I just wanted to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Library for supporting all of our programs. We couldn't do this fun stuff without them. I was also lucky enough to collaborate with a bunch of libraries to bring this program to fruition. So I would like to welcome patrons from Beverly, Canton, Dedham, Dracut, Lexington, Norwood, Sterling, Stowe, and Tewksbury. We are thrilled to have you. Let us know in the chat where you're coming from, because it's always fun to work with other libraries, says the librarian. So you also can put questions in the Q&A. I will be monitoring those. Use the chat for anything else, tech issues, chatter, hello, goodbye, whatever you need to do. And we already have somebody from Framingham. Awesome. So you can buy signed books by Bookplate from any of our authors from Bank Square Books, and I will put the link in the chat for you guys for that at the beginning and end of the program. So I think without further ado, I can get started on the important stuff. Well, not the important, the next stuff. So I'm going to introduce S.A. Barnes, who also goes by Stacey Kade. And as I told these guys earlier, I'm not great with introductions. I was just really curious about the fact that she sometimes used cheese sticks for bookmarks. Yeah, that's in your bio. High school librarian by day, horror writer by night. Love it. Christopher Golden is sort of like everything to horror, writes books, co-created the Outerverse comic book universe, and also founded the Merrimack Valley Halloween Book Festival, which I think you said is this weekend?
It's this Saturday in Haverhill. Yeah.
Need to go to
the library, of course.
And that's a beautiful library, so people should go. And then Anne Heltzel, who wrote Just Like Mother, which is like super creepy. She works for Abrams Books and writes as a ghostwriter, which I think is interesting for a horror novelist.
Less so these days, but yeah.
Yes, you have obviously your own books coming out, so that's pretty awesome. So I'm just going to hand it over to you with my first question, which is because my introduction was semi-lame. Anne, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your latest book.
Sure. Well, my first horror novel came out in May. It's Just Like Mother. I've got it right here. It's a cult story about the metaphorical cult of motherhood, and just the pressure that society places on women to be mothers. And I have written some young adult novels as well, and also ghostwritten, as was mentioned, and I'm an editor in the children's division of Abrams Books as my day job. So yeah, I know children's books and horror, it's weird, but it works.
Not that weird.
Well, I'm actually moderating a horror panel for children at the Boston Book Festival in a few weeks, so I'll have to talk to you.
Yeah.
Christopher, tell us a little bit about yourself and your latest book.
I've been writing full-time for 30 years this year. So I was 25 when I quit my job. My latest book, I write comics and screenplays, and I edit anthologies and write novels. And my latest novel, Road of Bones, came out in January. It'll be out in paperback right before New Year's Day. And it's about a terrifying ride along the coldest inhabited road on Earth. So I won't elaborate right now.
Sounds like a TV show I've heard of too, where where they go down the ice road in Alaska or something.
Yeah, do that, but add evil.
Okay.
I mean, that's sort of been the history of my life. Do that, but add evil.
Love it. Stacey, how about you?
So as S.A. Barnes, I've written YA and romance as Stacey Kade. My newest release is Dead Silence as S.A. Barnes. The quick summary of it is basically the Titanic in space, sort of. the Titanic meets The Shining in space. That's what I'm trying to say. Wow. Okay. Basically, this group of people who are out there doing a beacon repair pick up an old, outdated distress signal and they go to follow it, and it's a vessel that's been missing for 20 plus years, and they decide that they can get the salvage fee for that, which would help very much, as they're all about to be laid off, replaced by technology. But when they go on board, it's very clear that bad things have happened, and they're not exactly able to get out the way that they want to, as in alive. So
Alive is an important aspect of horror, I believe.
yes.
So let's go back to the beginning. Christopher, tell us what drew you to writing horror, and like, why horror?
I don't think I had a why. I don't think I had a choice. I was attracted to, I started a memoir not too long ago, and it starts with the line, my family moved away from the murder house the year before I was born. There were all kinds of strange things related to my life when I was a child. And maybe that was the reason why I gravitated toward the weird stuff always, but it was always the weird comic books, monster comics, monster movies. My brother and I would take the little black and white TV and put it on the big color TV and watch 2 movies at once, because we didn't have VCRs or cable or streaming in those days. It was just what I gravitated toward. And I think partly because horror makes it possible to believe in anything. I think everybody struggles to figure out what they have faith in, what they believe in. I'm what I refer to myself as a Christian atheist. This is way off topic, meaning that I believe in what Christians are supposed to believe in as far as how you're supposed to live your life, but I don't believe that there's a God. That's my, personal. But I think what you do when you're writing horror is you give people this gift. You create an elevated emotional state during which you make them believe in something horrifying, and usually something supernatural. And I think if you can give them that moment, you're also giving them that same moment where, if they can believe in that, they have to believe that there's something else, something better, something kinder, some power. So I think there's a real kind of magic in horror that's counterintuitive to what the experience is. And I think that might be one of the reasons that I was always drawn to it as a kid. And I wanted to tell those stories because I wanted to make people feel the way it made me feel.
Wow, thank you. Stacey.
Oh, how am I going to follow that? Okay. So I'll be honest, when I was writing Dead Silence, I thought I was writing a science fiction thriller. I did not think that I was writing horror. And then when I turned it into my agent at the time, she's like, first of all, this is horror. Second of all, you need to finish this because, because at that point, this was a big left turn for me, like career wise. I had not written very much for adults, and I certainly had not written horror. What's interesting to me is I grew up reading a lot of horror. I'm actually watching the Midnight Club on Netflix that just came out last week, which is based on a Christopher Pike. I loved Christopher. I read everything Christopher Pike, and then you go to Stephen King and Dean. You kind of move down the line, and V.C. Andrews, Flowers in the Attic, all that stuff. So I've read it. I've read it my whole life. I just never thought about writing it until I was, I guess, accidentally writing it. But I do think that someone else once pointed out to me that a lot of my books involve death. Which I've never really thought about. So I think horror in that way kind of gives you a safe way to explore that, sort of the unknowns of that. And I think that depending on, whether you're actually talking about ghosts and the afterlife and all that stuff, but death is, I think, definitely present, obviously, in horror. And I think that's something that has, not to sound morbid, has always interested me in terms of like the discussion and exploration of it.
Mm-hmm.
That did not sound morbid at all. Thank you. Anne?
Yeah, similar to Stacey, I read a lot of scary books as a kid. Fear Street was a huge series for me. And Wait Till Helen Comes. That was like the first book I read multiple times. And I liked the feelings that those stories evoked in me. And I think that I was sort of, for a long time, pushing myself. I think I was just always a horror writer, pushing myself away from writing horror. And part of that was honestly just some very silly anxieties I had about like what my family think of me. And, I come from a fairly, not ultra conservative, but like a somewhat conservative Catholic background. And I was a little, I think, overly concerned with what might people think if they knew the real me. And it was something I sought to hide for a while, and then realized I just couldn't hide it forever. That is just my imagination. It's dark, and I like it. And leaning into it has been such a relief and so much fun creatively. And honestly, I think for my next book after this one, I'm going even further with it. But taking that first step was really hugely important, I think, for me as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say I love that we just got Anne's horror coming out story. That was fantastic.
I was a closeted, dark, creepy person.
Yes, exactly. And I also just want to add, I think this is the first time that I didn't answer that question this way, and I should add this. When I was a kid, my first reader was my mom. She loved the stuff that I wrote, but she once said to me, "Why can't you write something nice?" And by that she meant, well, excuse me, why can't you write something good? By that she meant, why couldn't I write something nice? And I said, look, I've written romantic stories and science fiction stories and Western stories, but somebody always dies. So getting back to what Stacey was saying. So anyway.
Well, it sort of goes into my next question of, and I think I'm going to start with Stacey with this one, is the appeals of horror, but not necessarily like, your regular answer, but like, why do we as a reader want that level of suspense in our life?
Well, I'm going to detour just a little bit first to sort of get into my thinking on this. It's been really interesting to me watching the market for horror grow the last few years, I think, particularly because it seems to me, you would think, right, like when the economy is doing really well and everything's really stable and whatever, everyone would be like, yes, horror, we're feeling safe in real life, so it's okay to, but actually I think it's weirdly the opposite. I think when real life gets super stressful, people kind of pick one of two ways to go. They either land solidly on the 24 hours a day Hallmark Christmas movies, which I know, my family, some members of my family do that, and then also there you have the people who are like, well, I am dealing with whatever, inflation, job loss, whatever, but at least I'm not trapped by a serial killer in the basement. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's kind of the way. And I feel like horror can be a coping mechanism in some ways for whatever is going on in your real life. I feel also that from a reader's standpoint, it's that vicarious learning. You know what I mean? Like a friend of mine, Linnea Sinclair, she's a writer. She talks about, and I think she's quoting somebody else, and I apologize because I don't know who, but readers read to judge, right? We read to go, oh, we know you shouldn't go in that basement. Oh, we know you shouldn't, and we do that. And it's fun because we, the reader, get to be the smart one. We're the one yelling, going, don't go down there. I feel like there's an appeal to that as well. I don't know. So I think that's kind of why people like to read it, I guess. Those would be the primary reasons I would think.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Anne?
Yeah, along those lines, I think it's a lot about exerting control over circumstances, and when everything feels out of our control, being able to just enjoy a narrative that is very controlled and separate. And then, also I think as we get older, especially, there are very few things that surprise us as adults. And I think if we can find a thing that surprises us, it's like a gift. It's a new experience. It's like being a kid again. Everything you do as a kid is like so exciting. And so in certain ways, I think horror can shock and surprise and add that value to adulthood and bring us back to, how it felt to be a kid.
Mm-hmm. Christopher?
Just following on that, there's this incredible connective tissue between comedy and horror, because comedy is also sort of surprising. For a grown person to actually erupt in laughter, it has to come unexpectedly, right? You have to be struck by something that's not expected. And it also is this incredibly cathartic thing. Like if you're really laughing, when you're done with laughing, especially if it's a sustained, if you're in a film or whatever, if it's a sustained experience, when you're done, there's this physical relaxation that comes after it, in that cathartic thing. Horror does exactly the same thing. It just doesn't feel the same while it's happening, you know. I have a good friend, an author named Tony Tremblay, and Tony and I frequently go to the movies together, almost always a horror movie. And I love going to horror movies with Tony because when he's sitting next to me, he reacts to those movies more than anyone I've ever known in my entire life. I mean, we went to see Smile the other day. He must have, for a portion of the movie, he was literally sitting on the edge of his seat. And then for at least half a dozen times or more, he literally jumped and like threw him, like, you know, you see those videos that they want you to see about the reactions to horror movies. That's Tony every time. And I just know, as much as I'm having a good time, he's having a better time. And when the movie's over, he's going to feel the way we hope to make our readers feel. Like when they get to the end, even though they can close the book at any time, you just want them to feel like they escaped and they're okay and everything's going to be okay, you know.
Wow. Well, I have to say that I thought somebody would say it's a great date movie.
It's been a long time since I've been on a date to a horror movie. My wife hates them, so yeah.
It's not about the hating, it's about the you know, oh, I have to hold on to you type of thing.
Yeah.
Just a thought. Something that you said, Christopher, I think brought up a question from somebody about, did writing horror stories affect your relationships with your family? So I guess I'll start with you on this one, since you had mentioned your family, and I think Anne had as well.
Yeah, I mean, that was probably a springboard off of what Anne had said, but I mean, Dan, do you want to go first, or?
Sure. It did not affect my relationship with my family. I think I probably didn't give them enough credit. They're definitely, you know, I don't think that my parents liked Just Like Mother, and you know, honestly, my YA novels were pretty dark as well, so it wasn't a complete shock. But you know, I every now and then they'll mention something like, oh, why can't you just go back to the Twinkins, which was the name of like a middle grade novel I wrote like when I was in my 20s. Very whimsical and sweet. And you know, there is sort of that, I think there's somewhat of a lack of understanding, like not understanding why and where this is all coming from. But luckily, everyone still loves and accepts me, which is, you know, what I should have expected all along, I suppose. I'm lucky for that.
You know, neither one of my parents was really interested in horror in any way, shape, or form. But they were divorced when I was very young, but neither one of them attempted to interfere with it either. They sort of like saw it for what it was, you know, that I read. I mean, I think partly because I was reading adult novels when I was, you know, 9, you know, whatever, however old I was, you know. So, I mean, there was no such thing as Fear Street in the 80s, you know what I mean? Or the early 80s and 70s. So I didn't have any sort of disapproval in that sense, except that, of course, they didn't get it, you know, I mean, but that was fine. And my father, I always say, like, my dad, when I was really little, there was a series called Kolchak, the Night Stalker, which, if people are familiar with it, they know that it's sort of the thing that Chris Carter's, you know, was impressed by and created the X-Files as a kind of homage to. And my dad actually was not interested in this stuff, but when I was very young, it would only ran for one season, and the following year it ran again, but at 11 o'clock at night. So I would go to sleep, because I was 10 maybe. I would go to sleep at 9:30 or whatever my bedtime was, and my dad would wake me up at 11 o'clock at night to come in and watch Kolchak, because he knew I was desperate to see it. So he didn't get it, but he also was like, if that's what makes you happy, that's fine. So I did have that from them, and I felt very lucky. And you know, my brother and I watched a lot of horror movies together. He read a lot of the same books that I did when we were kids. We're only 2 years apart. but my sister is older and she loves what I do, but she was never into it.
Stacey, can I ask you a slightly different question?
Sure.
Because one of the things that you had said was that you write romance as well. So this is a question I tend to get with romance writers of, is this legit? Does this affect your relationships with your family? You know, things like that. I was surprised to, not surprised, but like, do you all get this question of, is this sort of a legitimate writing? Is it good writing? As you have mentioned earlier, Christopher, as opposed to real writing, you know, literary fiction kind of thing.
Well, so I kind of feel like my interests have always been, I'm always in the stepchild, you know, whatever that is, of real literature, whether it's, you know, because YA, some people consider that. And then I was, you know, YA science fiction or YA paranormal romance, which, you know, is for some people is as far away from real writing as you can get. You know what? And I guess to me, like, I think that's just sort of snobbery, and I'm not interested in that. And if people think that, they're welcome to think that, but I'm not going to let that bother me. I tell the stories that I'm interested in, that I hope other people are interested in. The thing that I try to keep in mind is that a good story, regardless of genre, regardless of how you want to classify it, connects with readers emotionally. So even if you want to crap all over somebody who sold thousands of copies of something you consider, you know, popcorn or whatever, you know, their various terms, or, you know, mommy porn or various other things that people have said, you know what, then you need to look at how they're connecting to people's emotions. You know, how are they doing this? Because there's craft there, there's skill there. And that's the thing I'm interested in. I want to tell a story and I want to tell it well. And you know, the people who, my whole like thing in life is, if you're going to read something, don't be ashamed of it. I'm not going to hide my book covers. I did say, I will be honest, when I wrote my 2 romance novels for adults, I did ask they not have a half naked man on the front, just because I didn't feel like that was actually the right fit for that story. But, you know, yes, some people will always think that about sci-fi, about horror, about romance. Well, you know, whatever, they can do whatever.
So Anne, aside from family, did you, I mean, not that, and they were very supportive, have you ever gotten any pushback about being a horror writer?
No, but I mean, what Stacey was saying is true. Like writing, when you write YA, like there's you get a lot of comments there, like, oh, you know, that's not real. So this is genre fiction for adults is a step up. But no, I mean, honestly, what I would say I get most is, you know, like, I don't know, growing up, it would be sort of like, I would accidentally take things to a dark place and people would be like, well, why'd you have to go that dark? And that's more it, the sort of knowledge that the way my brain works is different from a lot of other people's, at least within my social circles. But now I'm engaged to another horror writer, which is lovely because it's lots of date nights, as you know, you mentioned, watching horror, and also just a lot of acceptance. And, you know, I remember telling him that, and he was like, I don't even think you're that dark. You know, and it's like everyone else in my life has constantly questioned that. So, but no real, at least not to my face, no snobbery about the writing. Probably behind my back, who knows? But I don't care. I'm happy. So.
I love, Anne, that you do that thing. My whole family is so used to me. My wife and kids are so used to me doing the and then. You know, something will happen and I'll add the horror turn to the story, and they'll just like look at you like, what? Why? You know, look, horror has been the gutter genre for so long in the public mind, partly because, you know, once horror movies took the turn that they took when it became all about slasher films, and film producers realized that by making lowest common denominator horror films, they could make a profit, you know, and they could make a bunch of them and still make money. And then horror novels became super popular, partly thanks to Stephen King and the crowd around him in the 70s. And then book publishers began to do the same kind of things that horror movie makers had done, which was, let's churn out a bunch of lowest common denominator books because we need to fill the shelves. So people sort of had been reading this horror that they loved, and then they started stumbling upon these books that they were like, these are crappy. Maybe I don't like horror as much as I thought I did. And so horror crashed in the like 1990, early 90s, and has been, back in the gutter for so many years, until recently, until the last 3 or 4 years. And the thing that I find amazing is that the people who are breaking through and the books who are breaking through are incredibly talented. I love that we have a much more diverse roster. I think horror in many ways, other than YA, horror of the genres, I feel is the most diverse currently. And I love that. We're getting all kinds of different stories, but beyond the diversity, the kinds of horror stories that are being told and the quality of them is not new. It's just that I think that Stacey was right before, that people are seeking out that, and also this concept of elevated horror, which has been given to us by Hollywood. Elevated horror, it's just horror, is making people feel like they could be more respectable when they're reading horror stories. But the reality is that, and I know I'm going on, but I'll be quick, that the first American novel was a horror novel. It was written by Charles Brockden Brown. And some of the great works of literature that people still study and should still study, versus a lot of the old works that we shouldn't be studying anymore, are by Bram Stoker or by Shirley Jackson or by Mary Shelley. These are works of horror fiction. And last thing is, we can say whatever we want and people complain about it, but I believe that Stephen King is still the most influential and the quintessential American novelist of the 20th century. And I don't understand an argument against that statement. Anyway. So
I do want to say one thing really quick because I thought about it. Of all the genres and things that I have written, the thing that people, and I just something to think about, those of you, if you read romance or if you deliberately do not read romance, I have gotten more flack for writing romance, not because of what it is necessarily, but that people assume that I'm writing it based on personal experience. No one ever says to me, oh, have you been to space and seen a bunch of dead bodies floating in the air? No. But when I write romance, then they think that I have, obviously based this as a memoir in disguise. And I think we have a very weird hang up. And I think this is part of the puritanical, American sort of thing, which is, people still think of it as dirty books. You have a dirty mind. I've had people tell me that, which is really not fun. But I also really quick want to say, because I think my mom is out there listening, my parents have been super supportive. My mom is a teacher, my dad is a pastor. So you would think that would maybe cause some rumblings, but they've always been very great about anything that I have chosen to read and write.
Thank you. I'm sorry I skipped over you without that question. We actually, somebody in the Q&A did ask about, is publishing warming up to horror? And I feel like Christopher, you sort of answered that. And I do want to respond to her that she says she'd like to see more of horror sections in local libraries. We'll work on that, at least in Ashland. So I have a question, of course. What is the most horrifying or scary thing that you've ever written? And, something that even scared the pants off of you and you're like, this is it, I have to write it. Anne?
Interesting. I'm working on something now that I hope is the scariest thing. But I have a lot of nightmares, pretty much constantly, several times a week. The type where you have adrenaline just coursing through you when you wake up. And I have gotten into the habit of writing them down. And so technically those are probably the scariest things. But at one point, maybe 10 years ago, I started, I wanted to hold the visuals in my mind. So I just as a side project started sort of like painting them and just made a watercolor journal. It honestly took forever and I'm not a very good artist. So I dropped it fairly quickly, but it was something that I would like to return to. I think it was a frightening and interesting exploration visually, but then of course I couldn't retain the original visuals because I made these like awful representations of them. And then with, accompanying descriptions. The actual content specifically, I'd have to get back to you on that. There's so many. I could flip my phone open now and pick one from last night, probably. But
Wow. Christopher.
First of all, I'd like to say for anybody who's seen the film Host, that was a horror film made during COVID, during lockdown, I feel like they should make Host 2 about Anne's journal. Because when you were talking, I literally got a chill, because it's like, this feels like the setup, like we're on this call and we're going to see the demons from your nightmare right now. Anyway, not that
it might
yeah,
still
exactly.
happen.
I wish they had one of those reaction emojis just coming up from the corner.
I once had the most terrifying nightmare I could possibly imagine, but I won't bore you with the length of it, because it sounds like it happens to Anne frequently. Weirdly, I don't set out to write to be scary. 99% of the time. Occasionally, I think of something and I think, oh, that'll be really scary. I do try to create dread and uneasiness and suspense and sort of propel the story along with some kind of alacrity, but I don't think about making it scary, except occasionally. And one of my favorite moments, maybe not the scariest, but one of my favorite scares, is when Jonathan Mayberry asked me to contribute a story to, I don't remember the name of the anthology now, Don't Turn Out the Lights, I think it's called. And it was an homage to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So it was a very short, scary story for very young children. And this, I'm going to just tell you really fast. The story's about a young boy who's lying in his bed at night, and he hears his father calling to him from the window. And he looks outside, and his father is outside, and he's terrified, and he's telling him to, like, come out the window. Don't go out, don't go into the house, come out the window. And the boy's freaking out, but he's about to do what his father's telling him to do, and he starts to remove the screen from his window. And as he's doing that, his father walks into the room. And his father's outside, and his father immediately starts telling him, that's not me. Don't listen to him. That's not me. I'm telling you, come out of the house. That's not me. And the father inside is saying, come on, come back. It's, whatever. And he's freaking out and he's terrified and he has to decide. And finally, he's like, goes to go out the window, and the father inside grabs his leg, and he manages to fall out the window into the bushes. And he gets up and he looks over at his father outside, and then coming out from the trees is a third one. And then peeking around the corner of the house is a fourth one. And then there's another one, and it ends with something like, he tried to run, but there were just too many of them. And I almost always think what I wrote sucks. Literally 99% of the time, I'm like, and I've been doing this a long time. But very, very rarely do I think, oh, that's good. And that's one of my favorite things I've ever written, because I imagine myself at 10 years old reading that story and being freaked out for weeks. So there you go.
I'm a little older than that. I'm going to be totally freaked out for a week.
It's called The Open Window, if anybody wants to find it.
Find it. Yep. Stacey?
When I'm writing something, there are moments where this sounds so mean, where I'm like gleeful, where I'm like, ooh, this is gonna be fun. But it's never like, so it's rare for me. I do think it's interesting that all of us have mentioned, well, you guys have mentioned, and I'm going to add as well, nightmares. When I'm writing, when I'm really deep in a book, I am constantly having nightmares about being chased. Like when I was writing Dead Silence, this is not a spoiler, there are no zombies in there, but I was constantly having zombie dreams, and I'm not really a zombie person. I'm not quite sure what was going on there, but yeah, the scariest thing to me as a person, and as a writer, I'm not sure I've ever been able to articulate in a way, like where I could say, oh yeah, this is what this feels like. But I think I'm very interested in the intersection of mental health and horror, and especially that idea of not being able to trust yourself or not being able to trust your judgment. And so those, to me, well, again, I don't know that I can point to any section that I have written and gone, yeah, that's really scary. That to me is the scariest thing, that I'm always chasing, trying to explain what that's like when you're suddenly not sure, did I see that? Did this happen? Is my judgment sound? That to me is always that. And plus, I mean, you can't go wrong with, which I have used, where, somebody's foot is dangling over the bed and, somebody grabs them. I mean, you can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I think that not being able to trust yourself is one of the most terrifying things. I think that's why I loved Babadook so much. The whole, like, we've all been at that like precipice of like wanting to do something really, just like the fear of what you could do if you're just pushed too far. And the other one that really freaks me out is like someone you trust flipping, like just abruptly flipping. And for whatever reason, I think that's been a theme throughout all of my books, even like my YA like thrillers, but that they're no longer the person. And Christopher, your story reminded me of that, just this idea that they're no longer that person that you felt safe with. Well, it's
and it happening to yourself too. I mean, I've had several relatives who had Alzheimer's disease, and I've written at least 2 books that are inspired by the idea of losing your own sense of self and not being able to trust what you might do or have done. Yeah, that's terrifying.
I'm going to get into characters a little bit, because there's always like a bad guy or a scary guy, right, in your stories, or something that's bad or scary. And that so are those bad creatures ever redeemable? Or and I guess I say that in the way of, how do you make your bad guys or scary guys not one-dimensional, not just like Freddy Krueger, he's just scary. And I think I'm gonna start with Christopher there.
Well, I mean, Freddy Krueger is, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say he's one-dimensional, but he is straight up evil. I mean, he started as a child rapist, so I figure there's no coming back from that, and so I do think that that it's okay. I mean, I don't think that horror writers or anybody writing a story should be afraid. If you have evil in your story, like actual evil in your story, embrace that. There's nothing wrong with telling a story and having a creature or a person if you establish that evil can be evil. That said, aside from things that are purely evil, every villain thinks that they are the hero of the story. And I often, for pop culture geeks, I often use the reference of Professor X and Magneto in the X-Men. If you go into the comics, especially at the beginning, Professor X and Magneto were basically, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. I mean, they were basically 2 people looking at the same problem and coming up with 2 solutions, one of which was nonviolent and one of which was violent. But who's to say, if you're living that life, which one is the right solution, right? And so I think that if you're writing a good villain or even a good monster, unless you're willing to go all the way and say they're pure evil and define what evil means, right? Then you have to remember that the monster wants to eat your face because that's what it does. And it doesn't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, if you're eating a hamburger, what does the cow think? I mean, this is and so, yeah, that's my feeling about writing your monsters. I actually edited an anthology called The Monsters Corner, in which every story was through I think it was called, the subtitle was Stories Through Inhuman Eyes. And it was just about like, who's really the monster. So
Sort of like Monsters, Inc.
Yeah.
Totally
if there were real ghouls that ate, the bodies of the dead, are they monsters, or are they going to look at us and go, "You're destroying the planet. We're all all my ghoul brothers and sisters are going to die because you guys are destroying the climate." To them, from that perspective, we're the monsters. So you have to just like really remember that. That said, you still have to make it scary.
Stacey?
That actually reminds me, I was a big, and still am, a big Buffy the Vampire, the TV series, notwithstanding all the Joss Whedon stuff, but they just had a book that that came out or is coming out, and I thought it was really, I just saw the ad for it, was really interesting. It's like, the town of all the demons, and I'm thinking in particular like Spike or the vampires, or the one where they were playing cards for kittens. I don't know if you guys watched the show, but they were playing cards. And in any case, this town is full of demons and they're all getting along pretty much just fine. And then Buffy shows up, and it's kind of like she's the big bad. I think it's actually called that, the big bad, where she comes to their town and starts causing problem and killing people. And then they have to, it was just a really interesting flip. I think kind of like what Christopher was saying, to make a fully rounded character, whether we consider them a villain or a hero, they need to have a solid goal and motivation that makes sense to us. That's a great one. The Professor X and Magneto, that's a great one. I also think sometimes of, I've used Darth Vader as an example. These people think that they have come up with a solution for a problem, and everybody's just coming at it a different way. I tend to be more interested in humans being crappy toward one another for self-gain, because I think we see that a lot. So in this book, and actually somewhat in the book that I'm working on right now, there are certainly, terrible things that are happening, but a lot of it is caused, or some of it is triggered by people who are like, I gotta get it. I gotta look out for me, so then everybody's in danger because we're not acting as a community. We're not looking out for each other. But I kind of like sort of what Christopher said. I always think of the aliens in Alien and Aliens. They're just doing what they do, right? They're just eating and having babies and whatever. And this is how they do it. And in fact, I think in the first one, didn't we sort of mess with them I can't remember. One of them, we land somewhere, I don't know, and they were there first. So, there is that element of that. And I'm very intrigued by that, because who the bad guy is all depends on what perspective you're taking. And I think if you're writing a solid story, the person may not necessarily agree with why they're doing it or the path that they've chosen, but it needs to make sense. When I talk to kids about writing, or when I talk to adults about it, I'm like, you cannot have like the evil mustache twirling villain. I'm evil because I'm evil. Like that doesn't work. I mean, unless you're talking about like evil in the sense of larger, but just I'm going to do something because I'm the bad guy. That doesn't work.
Yeah. And Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I heard someone say on a panel long ago, just that your villain will be more compelling if their argument is as convincing as your hero's argument. So, their perspective, again, just has to be, I think, a strong, logical argument. So I always like to think of it, even if those points don't make it into the narrative, thinking of what, if we were on a debate stage, what they would be arguing for is really helpful. And then for me, honestly, like I'm just generally fascinated by psychology. My dad's a psychologist. I grew up just like, it was totally normal for me to go to therapy when I was a kid. Like it was, I just grew up in that world and hearing a lot about it and sort of like seeking to understand the way people work. And I always, like, to a degree that's maybe not healthy, like really just want to understand like the why of people. So in writing, I like to really explore backstory and life experience. And I do that somewhat. And just like Mother, going into these flashbacks of childhood that shaped who the characters are now. And look, like, it's like, speaking of Monster, Jeff Dahmer, the shows that's extremely popular on Netflix right now, goes into some fictionalized, but some true aspects of Jeff Dahmer's past. It doesn't redeem him. Of course, his acts are evil, but I do like the nuance it brings to his humanity.
Yeah. I mean, we still, you talk about Dahmer made me think of this. And I'm not indicting anyone except Dahmer. The fact that one of the best looking actors of the 21st century, Armie Hammer, has had his career vanish in a blink because he has been credibly, it seems, accused of all kinds of horrific things, including cannibalism. Not that he killed anybody, but like either the desire to eat human flesh or the sampling of human flesh or whatever. This isn't me, look it up. And the fact that like you look at that guy and you think, this guy wanted to eat human flesh. And so to what Anne was saying, like, you have to think about how the psychology of anybody you see. You know, there's a Canadian songwriter named Amanda Marshall who years ago had a song called Everybody's Got a Story. And I feel like there's a horror version of that too. You know, everybody's got a story. And I think we have to remember that. And then also to what you were saying, Anne, about psychology, to me, the thing that I love the most about the supernatural in stories is that it's such a great, not even the supernatural, a crisis. I like disaster movies, like when they're good, because the supernatural or whatever you bring in is the catalyst. Because everybody, like literally everybody, and especially in the last few years, we have so many things in our lives that are boiling under, like just bubbling under the surface of what's going on in our day. Like secrets or crises or just things we're trying to handle, that if a major crisis comes up, how are we going to respond? What is really going to be the thing that's important to us? What moves are we going to make that maybe we've been not making because we just want life to continue on its sort of ordinary path? So I just, you know, I think that it's the most versatile genre there is.
Also, I just wanted to add from a writing standpoint, I think that I've heard this before, a strong, what is it, strong villain, strong hero, or weak villain, weak hero. In other words, if your villain is not, your villain is cardboard, your hero doesn't look so great just being able to push him over. So I think that's something else you want to keep in mind as a writer.
Mm. Absolutely. As a reader too, like you want to read it, you want something that has that intensity, and that comes from their characters, I think. I'm going to do this sort of quick round robin of questions from the attendees, just asking one question per author, if that's okay. Stacey, what's the main thing you find interesting in horror?
What do you mean? Like, do you mean like what are the tropes that I like, or what is? I'll just tropes. In terms of tropes, I love the haunted house. I will always love the haunted house. I think everything I'm going to write is going to be some version of the haunted house in some way.
Awesome. I love haunted house as well. I just watched Hocus Pocus 1 and 2 yesterday. Anne, what is your work schedule like when you're writing, and does it affect the time you spend with your family?
Yeah, I mean, it's not good. I have a full-time job that is often more than full-time. So my work schedule is extremely erratic. It's late at night, it's weekends, kind of all the time when I'm on deadline. And, you know, I'm very lucky I don't have children yet. So I don't have that, you know, a further obligation, and my partner understands. He's also a writer, so he gets it. So I'm lucky, but also I'm kind of hyper aware of how it's not really sustainable way to live, honestly, and nor is it really the way I want to live. I love writing, but yeah, there's no easy answer to this one. It's tough to find a balance when you're a writer. It's difficult to write full time, but who knows? Maybe one day. I like my day job too, though. It's tough.
Anyway. Christopher, what makes a horror story a horror story? What are the elements?
Oh boy. Oh boy. I mean, for me, honestly, fundamentally, it's this is a gross way to put it, and I'm sorry to put it this way, but it's picking a scab. You know, usually for me, a horror story is finding something that's already there in an ordinary human life and irritating it, making you uneasy, making you feel dread about it, you're anxious about it, and all of that stuff. And then it's also sort of figuring out what matters to you and putting that thing in jeopardy. And, you know, again, there's so many things. I mean, but to me, horror is personal. It's intimate. It's, I mean, yeah, look, I mean, I like the the big, crazy, scary stuff as much as anybody. I mean, monsters that stomp on people, great, every day. But for me, a real horror story is a story that's about people. It's about sort of human experience and human emotion, and you know, how people are going to react when pushed.
Awesome. So I have a question about, and you're all welcome to answer this, but I'm wondering if, and somebody had asked this earlier about publishing and horror, and is there a schism between female horror writers and male horror writers? Is there an expectation that horror writers will be male or female? I'm just wondering what experience you've had, but from readers or the publishing world, about being the gender you are, writing the genre that you do. And I'm not going to call on somebody. You can just like jump in and tell us.
I'm going to go last because I have opinions, but I definitely don't want to share them before you do. I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I'm not, but I want to get you guys to go first.
So a little bit of a different case because I'm science fiction horror. So I think those are both considered to be, in general, if from a reader perspective, are probably considered male dominated genres, generally speaking. I did deliberately choose a pen name that is ambiguous. Not that I hid it. You can tell I have a picture in the back, and my website is who I am. But I did feel I have encountered in the past where people have said, I've actually had somebody even email me and say, if I had known you were a YA writer, I never would have picked up your book. I'm like, well, I'm more than one thing, but okay. So what I wanted in that case was I sort of leaned into it from the standpoint of, I want someone to judge this based on whether they think they'll like it and not their inherent biases. So theoretically, I should have trumpeted that, that it shouldn't have mattered, but I was also shameless enough to be like, well, let's see what the book does. What do you think of the book, and not of me? Like, I mean, it's a female lead character in first person. So it's not like, it's not like I was necessarily, and you can write in any gender you want, but I'm just saying, from the standpoint of, I wasn't trying to hide anything, just from this, I just wanted them to pick it up based on, without having that immediate ew. Because I do think, maybe more in science fiction than in horror, but I do think there is that reaction among a certain subset of readers.
Yeah, I think historically it's a genre that's, where male writers have dominated, but I think that is shifting within the publishing industry, and there's so much support for people who identify as genders other than male. And I'm a very happy writer with Tor Nightfire, which is a somewhat newer horror imprint, and a lot of their writers are female or elsewhere on the spectrum of gender identity. And I think there's just there's so much now that's being done to support all kinds of writers in the genre. Whether or not, I just can't, I don't know about, the readership. I don't know if the readership is less welcoming. Certainly possible. But I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of opening doors for new types of writers.
So again, having been a reader for many years before that, and having been in this for 30 years, and being a straight, white, middle-aged, cisgender, heterosexual, I said straight, duh. I certainly, horror was so male, and let me say white male dominated for so many decades, that it was, it went basically unnoticed by the genre, not by readers who weren't that, clearly, but by the genre. It went completely unnoticed. I look back at the early anthologies that I edited, and what the lineups were, and there always were women writers in those anthologies, but even then the ratio was off, and they were almost always white, again, not through any conscious choice. I would like to think, and maybe this is just maybe this is me being incredibly subjective, but again, observationally, I think that horror has been way more aggressively diverse, or diversifying in a more positive and aggressive and progressive way than other genres seem to be. You don't see sad puppies showing up in horror. And I think it's because horror is, from my perspective, made up so often, both from the readership and so many of the writers I know, of people who are or have been broken in their lives, who have experienced mental health issues, who have experienced some otherness that has drawn them to this genre. And so the idea of becoming more inclusive is not anathema to horror the way it is to, in many ways, science fiction, and not quite as much, I think, in fantasy. I am thrilled. It's funny because I do see complaints. I see complaints from, middle-aged white guys who are frustrated that it's becoming more difficult for them to sell a book than it was before. Well, guess what? I mean, if the playing field is being leveled, or in the process of being leveled, and you can no longer compete, all that means is that when the playing field wasn't level, you weren't good enough to beat those people before. Like, if you aren't able to compete now, or it's harder for you, it just means that you benefited from the system the way it was constructed previously. And so I do think it's getting harder. And perversely, perhaps, I'm really happy about that. So yeah, I mean, I do think that it seems I see a lot more female writers. I see a lot more writers who are non-binary, who are trans women or trans men. A lot more writers of color, in the horror field, and I see horror clamoring for these voices, for these other books, and I, frankly, I don't really see that elsewhere. I see it in YA, but I don't see it in the adult genres, the other sort of factions of the adult genres, nearly as much as horror, and it makes me proud to be a horror writer.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's probably true that on the adult side, this is where a lot of change is happening, and for all the reasons that you mentioned, Christopher. And it's interesting because it has been such a welcoming community, and online, and particularly on Twitter in particular, children's books aren't always welcoming. So in fact, like some of the least welcoming of any genre. And it's been so lovely to be welcomed in this way. And then, in terms of publishers, I think the reason, maybe this is just me speculating, but because horror is historically a more niche genre where, the bookstore shelf is smaller, there were fewer people publishing it. I think any issues that are inherent to the publishing industry were sort of magnified within, you could easily look at that subsection of published authors and identify where problems were, when really they affect the entire industry. And yes, I think, there are a lot of efforts being made within the genre, within horror, to correct past problems.
Yeah. I just want to add, Anne, to what you're just saying, that, I see my friend Jennifer McMahon is a great example, and your book is a great example, that even 10 years ago, these books would not have been considered horror. That after the crash of horror around 1990, so many writers who have that dark, part of themselves, who want to have that darkness in their work, fled category horror for survival's sake, so that they could continue to write. And because horror has had this renaissance, and those writers are now in the pool again, I feel like there's this greater respect for horror, because it isn't just the things that can't be identified as anything else. And I love that. And I think that, I think one of the reasons why horror is welcoming is that it's so used to being the gutter genre that we look around and we think, okay, now we have these other authors who are getting more respect, and that rubs off on the genre in general, and we feel like a rising tide lifts all boats. right? And so it does feel like more communal, I think. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
I just wanted to, I second everything that everybody has said. I wrote in YA for a number of years, and obviously romance, but horror, the writers, the professionals in here, they have been so welcoming. I mean, I've so welcoming, so kind, reaching out, when because as a writer coming into a new genre, you're like, hi, I have this book. Would you want to read it? Maybe. And it's a really hard place to be, because I didn't really have any close contacts. Obviously, I'm a horror reader, but that doesn't necessarily mean people in the horror genre to be like, hey, can you blurb my book? Can you read it and see if you like it? And everyone was just so very generous with their time, and very supportive. Omakatsu is amazing and just a lovely human being, and obviously a gorgeously talented writer. And she was incredibly generous, and I'm just so grateful, and I have felt very welcome, which, to Anne's point earlier, is not always the case across the board, and I am just thankful.
I think readers are too. Like, I think that's something that we look for, and I think, Anne, I appreciate that you stretched out my male female kind of perspective into, like, it's really the whole spectrum that is as Christopher said, sort of being lifted right now, and it's really wonderful for us the readers to see that, something that we've been wanting for so long. So just really quickly before we go, we're about out of time. I just would like to know what's up next for you. What can we expect coming out soon? Christopher.
Actually, tomorrow in comic shops and next month in bookstores, I have a new novella with Tim Levin called Festival, which takes place in England at a music festival and has Viking ghosts and horrific slayings and wonderful stuff like that. But actually the next big thing is my new novel comes out in January. It's called All Hallows. And it's a sort of nostalgic 1980s Halloween night horror story.
Ooh, it sounds so good. Stacey?
It was fun.
I have something that hasn't been announced yet.
This is the perfect time.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm allowed to yet.
Oh, the publisher won't mind. They told me.
I'm gonna send them your email address when they get mad at me. Talk to him. He said I could do it. I will. I do have another sci-fi horror coming up. I haven't really practiced a pitch for it, but basically this one is they're like a reclamation and exploration team in the world where corporations are claiming planets, and they go and the way that this started is really quickly is in Antarctica. I read about these things called ghost stations. They're science stations that are abandoned by various countries when they no longer are using them, and I thought, oh, that'd be cool. So this team comes and they take over a ghost station that's been left by a corporation, and there's some weird stuff going on there. It happens to be a planet that has alien ruins from 10,000 plus years ago. So maybe something's related to that. Maybe it's not. We don't really know, but there's a lot of people who are behaving in a very odd and dangerous manner.
And when is that coming out?
I don't know.
Right, well,
that's not true.
I want to read it.
I would happily send you one.
Yes,
it is. Please. I think it'll be 2024. I think. Thank you.
Yeah, my next one, I have another one under contract with Poor Nightfire that I'm working on now, and it's not, I don't know when it'll be out. Sometime in 2024, I hope. It doesn't have a title yet, but thematically, without going into too much detail, it's a lot about ageism and fears of growing older and becoming irrelevant and being trapped in a body that you no longer identify with, and things like that. And also the way that sort of wealth can purchase longevity. So those are the big themes, but in terms of plot, very much still work in progress. And, I also go a little bit into connection and how we're just, sort of losing, like, without delving into the internet's influence on it, just how human beings are finding it more difficult to connect. So it's just all stuff that's been swirling in my head and fitting into a creepy tale. There'll be some scary houses. I love architecture, old stuff. So that'll be there.
Great.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, so many good things to look forward to. Well, I would like to say thank you so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure, and I just can't wait to read everything that's coming out. And I really appreciate your insight into why the genre is what it is. I think sometimes we don't get to hear that. We just enjoy the scare. So thank you for your time and your thoughtful answers to all of these various questions. And truly, I do really look forward to your next books.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, Nina.
Thank you so
absolutely.
much.
Yep, and thank you everybody for being here. I'll send out a recap with the recording video link, as well as the link for buying books if you would like to. Anyways, have a wonderful night, everybody. I hope you have pleasant dreams.
You too. Everybody have a happy Halloween.
Yeah,
Thank
happy Halloween.
you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.